are continuing our afternoon, returning back from Messina to Lisbon, but also to deal with the aftermath and the legacy of the Lisbon earthquake with Professor Joana Cunha Leal, which she teaches graduate and postgraduate courses on 19th and early 20th century art theory and historiography. A recent work privileges the study of Iberian modernisms and the avant-garde. A research project, Other Modernisms, the case of Amadeu Sousa Cardoso, was awarded a Fulbright Research Fellowship in 2010. She was also a fellow of the Stone Summer Theory Institute in 2011 and PI for the project Southern Modernisms. She is currently PI for the project Iberian Modernisms and the Primitivists Imaginary and director of the Art History Institute of the Universidade Nova de Lisboa, and now also part of the direction of Universidade Nova, the faculty. And she is presenting us a communication called Lisbon After the Earthquake, Out of the Ground Zero. And it is a sort of continuation of a work that comes since the preparation of her PhD on the aftermath of the earthquake. So, with no further ado, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nuno. Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a great pleasure to be here and to share some thoughts on catastrophe and the rebuilding of cities. I feel I'm very lucky to speak after the previous conference because it gives us a framework in which to operate and see what is happening in Lisbon in the 18th century. So I'm not sure if you are seeing, okay, the slides. And okay. So the title of my paper, of my presentation, is taken from a volume edited in 2002 named Out of Ground Zero, Case Studies in Urban Reinvention, that was edited by Joan Oakman after the disaster of the Twin Towers. Lisbon devastation by the earthquake in 1755 and the rebuilding process that followed the catastrophe opens that volume that considers other examples of cities' massive destruction, such as Chicago after the Great Fire, or the bombing of Rotterdam, Plymouth, Berlin, Hiroshima during World War II, and the destruction occurring in a much recent chronology in the Balkan cities, Jerusalem, and of course, New York City. I actually dislike the term ground zero. Besides evoking a modernist utopia, once applied to the city, it completely fails to address the many layers that compose the urban experience. It may refer to the city's built environment, but it misses the complexity of its lived social space, the richness of its collective memory, and the images and representations supported by them. That is the immaterial, lived, remembered, desired, imagined parcels of urban experience. But despite the fact that I disliked it, this kind of a term serves me here to bring in the depth of the transformation of Lisbon brought in by the catastrophe, which deserves to be acknowledged. And my thesis is that the key impact that the earthquake caused can be measured by, of course, its primary elements, and I got to get, being them the urban grid designed by Eugenio dos Santos and Carlos Mardel, and the monumental Praça do Comércio open in the front of the Tagus River. Indeed, the rebuilding of the city center after the earthquake under the Marquis de Pombal government produced a complete transformation of Lisbon. its image and representations were completely transformed. There is a radical aspect in the rebuilding program, even though many signs, and this is very significant, even though many signs of the destroyed city endured, be it the location of the main squares, and we see here the rebuilding plan again, but there is this image of an image of Lisbon long before the earthquake that shows the same location of the squares, Rocio and the Praça do Comércio, Terreiro do Paço before. The memory of the royal palace also remained in the way we address the name of this main square, or the remnants of ruined buildings assimilated in the Il Chiado area, or also the mandatory distribution of small industries and commercial activities in predetermined streets following traditional, even medieval, regulation for professional activities. These survivals, of course, do not contradict or jeopardize the success of the rebuilding plan in transforming the ways the city was perceived, identified, represented, lived, and therefore built throughout the 18th century and the 19th century as well. My thesis is that as determinant as the impact of the much praised primary elements that I've just mentioned is the effect of the new residential buildings that had the effect that the new residential buildings had in the public perception of the city once they expanded erudite design bourgeois multifamiliar housing structures in an unprecedented scale. So I won't be sharing with you a comprehensive explanation of Lisbon's rebuilding plan, clarifying the complex framework of major legal, organizational, and constructive issues that range over the Pombalin city and its architecture. I will nevertheless refer to some of the main challenges faced by the rebuilding plan, while focusing on the analysis of Pombalin residential buildings and the prospective impact they had in the city as a standard of regular architectural design. I will stress how this standard imposed itself in urban areas located outside the limits of the rebuilding plan, areas that were nevertheless subjected to intense densification after the earthquake, determining in years to come both the abandonment of the prevailing vernacular way of building and the systematic correction of irregular facades. Post-1755, Lisbon's central area was drawn by a group of architects and military engineers that follow a program set by their commander-in-chief, Manuel da Maia. Maia's thoughts on the recovery of the city destroyed by the earthquake, tsunami, fire sequence of November 1st, 1755. I'm sorry. That's the image of the disaster that I wanted. These Maya thoughts, I was saying, were thoroughly presented in his dissertation, a three-part program test that ruled the reconstruction hand in hand with the legal support provided by the Marquis de Pombal government. As Paulo Varela Gomes has put it, a thorough understanding of the reconstruction plan, approved just 2 years before the earthquake, must be considered, a thorough understanding of the reconstruction plan must consider that, and I quote, it was not only meant for the future, it was also against the past. Indeed, taking Lisbon's former image into account, Maya specified that the city arising from the rebuilding, and there it is, Maya specified that the city arising from the rebuilding plan should be an entirely new one, a rational urban setting supported on classical principles and pragmatic concerns broadly identified by the notion of regularity. Regularity ruled the entire Pombalin undertaking, defining its urban and architectural design against the sweeping irregularity of the previous city center, unaware of sanitary norms, dominated by loop-sided and dead-ended narrow streets, and by vernacular architecture. The option for redesigning Lisbon's central area created considerable difficulties. Although it was presented as the only valid alternative, Maya states the complexity of the calculus implied in assuring the rights on private property, and we've seen this big issue in the previous paper. The discussion around property and the compensation due to former landlords would meet Maya's errant commitment to the improvement of the city that included high standards of hygiene and building security. Pombal's despotic power was, of course, key in securing this option, allowing the rebuilding plan to move forward. Like some other cities modified or expanded under Enlightenment pedagogy, Maya refers London and the expansion of Turin, Lisbon's rebuilding plan pushed to the limits the idea of common interest policy. Besides property issues, it included ignoring the previous location of the churches, and this was a main issue, of course. Rationally designed urban setting, wise distribution of public spaces and public buildings, decorous classical architectural solutions, and exigent salubrious standards were options sustained by an idea of common interest that would ensure a renewal of civic life and economic development, in this case oriented towards the very bourgeois commercial interests that would sponsor the undertaking. But I must add here, because of the talk we previously heard, that in the case of Lisbon, the challenge was to build an inclusive city where everybody was needed, and it was really very, very difficult because gentrification nevertheless occurred. So the bringing in different kinds of people from different classes was a real serious preoccupation. As I mentioned before, regularity was the conceptual tool orchestrating the multiple demands of renewal. Pragmatic needs being much more precise than the general notion of improvement that Maya evokes. Emergent ideas on public health and security in construction were the basis for concrete measures: the anti-seismic wooden structure named Gaiola, the water supply provided by a network of new public fountains, and here's the structure, and the construction of a sewage system and a public garden. Conversely, the notion of Lisbon's improvement is rather broad and vague. Maya's discourse includes both the intention to look after public interests through the mentioned sanitary and security measures and the will to promote Lisbon's embellishment. Therefore, the idea of improvement foreshadowed an aesthetic criteria embedded in Casa do Risco's main fields of activity. First, the urban plan that I've shown, Maya's aesthetic, in the urban plan, Maya's aesthetic improvement would be prompted by street design. Streets taken out to be the basic spatial elements of the city would benefit from the combined effect of their linear design and increased wideness, allowing the definition of sidewalks, and we see here the novelty of the sidewalks. In architecture, the aesthetical plus would be brought by program design. That is, by the fact that buildings' facades were from now on controlled by design and devised in accordance with basic classical forms, also referencing erudite architectural standards. Pombaline architecture's new qualities of uniform design and symmetry would, Maya writes, strengthen the general regularity of Lisbon's new quarters. Taking the expectations defined in Maya's text, it might be eventually stressed that the uniform pattern conceived for architecture was not, at least not only, an outcome of an economizing strategy or a result of the prefabrication system applied. It was also the result of architects' will to create regular, embellished compositions in accordance with the ideological synthesis occurring in Enlightenment between rational policy and the urge of taking both pragmatic and aesthetical exigencies into consideration. While perhaps not being a perfect synonym of the beautiful, regularity was nevertheless considered to be its essential condition. Lisbon's rebuilding plan was indeed drawn to outshine prevailing vernacular building solutions. That is, housing structures that were usually 1 or 2 story high, and that are easily recognizable by their rather irregular and asymmetrical compositions. At ease, these compositions are at ease, alternating wall areas, either blind or pierced by a series of small openings corresponding to the interior staircase, and fenestrated ones whose openings could also be dissimilar, corresponding to residential spaces or repeatedly admitting gable ends, just as we see here. So I reckon this is the images that we have to consider while recognizing the dimension of the renewal proposed by Pombaline architects. In the new erudite context of Pombaline architecture, interior staircases location, marks, and gable ends on a facade became unthinkable, for regularity took over the standard 4-story buildings with balconies on the first floor. In the upper yield of Chiado, the second floor was also ennobled with balconies, as you can see here. And dormer windows on the fourth on the fourth floor, following the social vertical hierarchy for the residential offer within the same building, which meant that everybody had a place, even the small artisans would live in the dormer floor. Dormer windows had been particularly mentioned as an essential ennobling feature of housing facades in the text accompanying the rebuilding plan. This text also asserts that the idea that these windows should be drawn as it was done in other European crowns. It's the expression. Thus making a clear reference to the international panorama of erudite design housing buildings appearing in French Place Royale, in the Covent Garden, or in Berlin, in places like Friedrichstraße. The remarkable aesthetic distance evident on Pombalin residential architecture at the same time, at the time of its creation and first reception, as it clearly detaches itself from the previous leading vernacular paradigm, was also reinforced by straightforward formal solutions quoted from the realm of noble architecture. The block scale that conceals building units in the downtown area of Baixa, the monumental pilasters set at the corner of each block, lacking any significant supporting role, the coupling of portals and balconies of Rocio and Chiado buildings, and even the dormer windows were commonly used in such a universe of reference, the noble architecture. Finally, approaching noble architecture and taking erudite apartment buildings formulas as minimum standard for the qualification intended for the city about to be rebuilt also implied a significant transformation of common housing interiors. Lisbon's reconstructed areas benefited from a housing program providing superimposed apartments with defined boundaries within the same building. There is multifamily structures organized as a sum of independent and socially multi-targeted dwellings, either one or two per floor, served by well-defined common shares, entries, hallways, landings, and stairs, benefiting from significantly increased interior living areas. This rational program broke with modes of co-housing enshrined in common housing tradition, applying to multifamily residents a standard of privacy scarcely known beforehand. This rupture was, of course, being prepared long before the earthquake, but only the renewal of the entire residential offer could have converted it into a normal city-scale practice. So, although it is now considered, I'm going to open here a parenthesis that will lead me to my conclusion. Although it is now considered to be one of the major achievements of enlightened urban ideals, one that brought forward urban planning as establishing conditions for a salubrious and rationally ordered public life in the city, the geometry supported and uniform renewal of Lisbon was not always recognized as a significant contribution to architecture and city design. As I have discussed elsewhere, monotony, pragmatism, parsimony, and lack of originality were the main characteristics attributed to Pombalin quarters by those who commented the reconstruction since the late 18th century. A surplus of regularity was quickly taken to be the most evident and impoverishing feature of the newly rebuilt city. These abiding anathemas, initially perceived by Beaux-Arts architectures, neoclassical architectures, cast a vast and enduring shadow over the undertaking. Lisbon's center was not an achievement of fine artistic value, but a work injured by aesthetic marginality. Only in 1965, José Augusto França's book prompted a consistent turning point in this regard. In fact, the enrollment of downtown Pombalin Quarter, Baixa, in Portuguese heritage was achieved in September 12, 1978, as a direct outcome of his study. Following the early analysis of a modernist architect, Profílio Pardal Monteiro, who saw the reconstruction of Lisbon as foreshadowing the modern movement, França's study places Lisbon rebuilding plan within the Enlightenment aesthetics, pointing out the artistic dimension of the new city. França's point is based on the election of the two primary elements of the newly built city. These elements support the symbolic and artistic value of the new city, allowing the historian to partially overturn the accusations of monotony and pragmatism. Praça do Comércio was a key piece in this legitimating process. Being the only monumental public space in the new city and benefiting from an extraordinary geographical location on the waterfront of the Tagus River, it had already been classified as a national monument in 1910. França not only reaffirmed its singular quality, but also reinstated its major symbolic relevance for taking the place of the ancient Terreiro do Paço. For it took the place of the ancient Terreiro do Paço. The other key, and this time new, argument for the defense of the Pombalin recovery's aesthetic value is the idea that the reconstruction of Lisbon was, and I quote, essentially an urban phenomenon. It is as such that its artistic value is vindicated once the, and I quote again, once the significant qualities of the work are precisely for França, the immediate and aesthetic beauty of the plan, with its rational simplicity, economic and realistic sobriety, and programmatic beauty as a political ideal. End of quote. In opposition to the merely quantitative rhythm attributed to the housing buildings, França stresses the variation effect introduced in the urban grid of Baixa, an effect obtained by the contrast between the transversal and longitudinal alignment of the blocks and by the variations of streets width. These solutions create, he says, a dynamic rhythm that energizes the urban grid, saving it from the apparent monotony. On this basis, José Augusto França succeeds in affirming the aesthetic value of Pombalin Lisbon on the solid ground of originality and innovation praised by modernist artistic ideals. He could then point out the radical submission of architecture to urbanism, stating that the formal language of the housing buildings is not only supported but is also legitimated by the dynamic of the orthogonal grid. Moreover, France asserts that the housing buildings, without any ornamentation and produced on a serial process, I'm sorry, I lost okay. In the end, he says that the buildings cannot be, and I quote, aesthetically individualized, forgetting their determination, or in other words, the urban grid. He therefore defends that there are no isolated buildings, but only blocks, groups of building quarters. Such a conception implies that we can only analyze the main Pombalin building if we understand it as a unity of those groups. So, José Augusto França associates the surplus of regularity that putatively impoverishes Pombalin architecture to the pragmatic empiricism of military practice acquired in building fortifications and in colonial town planning. So, rather than discussing the extreme difficulty of the author's attempt to define a Pombalin style arising from this perspective, I will focus my attention on the idea that he paid a high ransom for this incomplete aesthetic recovery of the rebuilt city. Not only kept underestimating residential architecture that remains condemned for its monotony, but he was also forced to ignore the remaining part of the Pombalin city. I mean, the half of the plan, that is actually Chiado, that, although geometrically designed and colonized by the same housing typology as Baixa, did not benefit from the dynamic orthogonal grid. So, my point here is to address the paradox implied in the simultaneous recognition of the importance of the housing typology and its lack of aesthetic qualities. França avoids this situation by pointing out the exceptional elements, but the paradox still endures because if on the one hand we can assume that Praça do Comércio and the urban grid are in fact primary elements of Lisbon after the earthquake, on the other hand, one must acknowledge that the configuration of the city is developed upon a wider urban heritage that cannot be understood without considering the residential fabric. From this perspective, the aesthetic marginality attributed by high criticism to Pombalin architecture cannot be forgotten or left to a secondary plan. Besides its overwhelming presence, the Pombalin housing buildings, residential buildings, are the guarantee of the unity of a plan that brings together the orthogonal grid of Baixa and the upper town affected by different topographical conditions and several architectonical remnants in Chiado. Moreover, it severely contrasts with common sense appraisal of this housing typology. The continuous growth and densification of the city during the late 18th and 19th centuries prove that this typology permeated the whole of the urban territory, either appearing as a structure flexible enough to be reinterpreted and enriched, or, more significantly for my argument, as a standard for aesthetic re-evaluation of the urban landscape in other areas of the city. And now we see the city in the late 18th century with other growing areas completely defined. You see Lapa here, and the project for the Águas Livres, and the entire Cotovia, what we call Cotovia, is also 18th century, late 18th century urban areas of Lisbon, as the color of the map shows. As I tried to summarize so far, Pombalin residential structures defined and recaptured the bourgeois habitat by applying a regular and standardized architectural program with ennobling references, promoting privacy between the different apartments, enlarging interior living spaces, and presenting rental buildings destined to different social levels of potential dwellers. As it was able to anticipate and systematize all these renewal symptoms of bourgeois dwelling, Lisbon's construction could not have failed to produce a thorough reconfiguration of the expectations horizon of cities' inhabitants and buildings, be them architects, landlords, owners, or politicians, etc. This reconfiguration can be gauged in the continuing expansion and densification of residential areas external to the Pombalin plan, because it prompts an increased level of exigency concerning the minimum requisites of housing buildings, and at the same time it lowered tolerance towards anything that would not dignify the city image, from inappropriate behavior, considered inappropriate behavior, to inappropriate vernacular solutions in the realm of common architecture. This major effect is traceable over a very long span of time, and it concerns not only the prevalence of longevity of the building type designed for Lisbon's central areas, but also, and more significantly, the evident signs of condemnations of vernacular architecture by, and I want to underline this, by ordinary citizens and landlords without any architectural education. So now I'm showing you post-earthquake vernacular housing buildings that maintain the kind of vernacular types that were in fact dominated the city before the earthquake. These are post-earthquake buildings in the area we know as Cotovia, which means the part of the city that comes out from Rua da Escola Politécnica to Rua de São Bento. Here in Praça das Flores, we see the same kind of vernacular distribution that is maintained. So I'm talking about the prospective impact that Pombalin architecture has regarding the entire city, and also the correction of these abiding modes of vernacular building, still very much present in the years after the earthquake. Such prospective impact becomes noticeable when one studies the collection of facade drawings enrolled in the catalogue named Livro dos Prospectos, archived owned by the Municipal Archive. This 19th century original catalogue puts on record the constructions that would have a foreseeable visual impact on the city, and had therefore to get a license from Lisbon City Council Building Department. in the 19th century. This archive runs from October 1845, when the enrolling of the projects became mandatory, to 1874, when the archive was completely reorganized. The information gathered in this catalog, along with the existing drawings corresponding to 2/3 of registered records, allows us to locate and date those building licenses and to get to know the nature of these building interventions in a significant number of cases. They could be entirely new buildings, or the rebuilding of pre-existing structures, addition of new floors to a previous building, or the redesign of existing facades, as we see now. Being a reliable indicator of the dynamics of urban construction, this collection of anonymous housing buildings clearly demonstrates that the value of regularity sustained by city areas reconstructed under the rebuilding, the Pombalin plan, was able to reconfigure the Lisbonans' expectations horizon, appearing as a principle shared by the entire community. It did so in terms that would be responsible for raising basic needs standards and creating a critical base in the realm of domestic architecture. There is a noteworthy tendency for a much more generous conception of minimum interior spaces to live, but its clearest expression would be the significant flow of elective building projects eager to eliminate the asymmetries and ill-projected solutions of previous projected solutions of previously accepted in these external areas, previously accepted vernacular constructions and wooden houses. What has to be stressed here is the fact that the will to correct vernacular modes unfamiliar with architectural design primary rules, testified by those 19th century drawings, was not a movement forced by general law, city council regulations, or professional advisements. It was set in motion by the consolidation of an architectural culture nourished by the reconstruction paradigm of regularity, and therefore globally deplores demonstrations of compositional irregularity and tries to eliminate there. The examples are infinite. Not infinite, but are really, really many. To sum it up, it shows us that the appraisal for regularity soaked common sense and radically transformed the image of the city, for it stood as a standard against which Lisbon's vast vernacular landscape would undergo an aesthetic re-evaluation. In a final word, it shows that vernacular irregular facades became unworthy of Lisbon's landscape. Thank you. And sorry if
Thank you very much for this very interesting and motivating presentation. We still have some time for questions. So if anyone has a comment or a question, please do. Não sei se não é melhor vir para aqui.
Okay, I really enjoy your presentation, Joana Cunha Leal, because it makes me think about lots of aspects of the architecture I believe. And I would like to say something about your very detailed explanation of this architecture from Baixa Pombalina, which I think that can be understood as this idea of collective architecture. I mean, for me, and he did not wrote about that hypothesis, but I think if I have to say to a student the best example of the idea of the architecture of the city, I would think about Lisbon and Baixa Pombalina. And as much as I know, the idea of Baroque city in Germany, even in Berlin, you mentioned the Friedrichstrasse example, show us that at that time, of course, Marquês de Pombal was I don't know the precise word, but he wanted to define everything and to take command from the new city. But there is an aspect that Giorgio Grassi always underlining in that attitude, which is the idea that the city belongs to everybody, and that the interior of that house belongs to the intimacy, but the exterior belongs to everybody. And I really like that idea, and I remember a text I read from you that I really like, where you quote, I think, maybe a historian or someone who wrote about the city in the guide and says that it's boring and not very interesting. And what I would like to ask, or to maybe to make you explain even more, because I know that you know a lot about this theme, and which I think it has a lot to do with the catastrophe of contemporary architecture, is that in Baixa Pombalina, as much as I know, looking from Porto, which is not far away from Lisbon, but I do not know so much about the history of Lisbon. But I like these two buildings, one from Ventura Terra and the other one from Carlos Ramos, which is the father of my school, and that's why I'm addressing the question. And I like particularly the moment the building from Ventura Terra is the one that is Banco Totti Açores, and the other one, it is the Aves building, or known by this name. And I like that moment when Carlos Ramos, the architect of the Porto School of Architecture, confesses in a conference that if he could, he would have done the building precisely with the same aspect of the Pombalin building. I think he underlines the possibility of destroying everything that he have made. The building is very beautiful in his difference from the other buildings, and from the point of view of the typology, it's very different, because it has the three levels of it includes the service, or the third domain of uses in the city. And what I'd like to hear from you is, what do you think about the future of this idea of a Pombalin architecture in the contemporary discourse about the city? Because I think it has a lot of future.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your comment. And There are two. I think I can bring in two aspects. One is that the idea that the Pombalin residential building is truly the true Portuguese house. It has already a long story. It was put forward for the first time by Castilho, by Júlio Castilho, and he is the one that calls attention to his contemporaries. He's writing a book on Lisbon and called Lisboa Antiga in the end of the 19th century, and he says, you are all discussing a rural typology, and I think that the Pombalin building is I've written a lot about that. It's probably the text that you know. The Pombalin building is really the type of housing that we should be looking at. And the other moment is definitely the modernist one. It's Paulo Varela Gomes has a very, very significant study, and that I quote about the rediscovery of Lisbon by, not the rediscovery actually, he talks about the contest for embellishing Rocio, and it calls our attention to the fact that the majority of modernist architects really intend to barockize or to transform Pombalin architecture into something that the project and the architecture and the urban design clearly did not want it to be, which is a Baroque city. Pombalin city did not consciously look for perspectives and for significant ornamentation and dramatic effects in architecture, and this was an option. And the case is, what I think it's, we have to take it seriously, and this is what I've been trying to do. This is an option, and an option that demands that our aesthetical understanding of the city, of what a city should be, is also, we need what some historians call a nettoyage du regard, to clean our eyes and to understand this option as a valid option in terms of aesthetic, also in terms of aesthetic value. So the Pardal Monteiro is actually the first modernist architecture that rediscovers Pombalin architecture and that praises both the plan and the buildings, even though he recognizes that they are sober and without and perhaps serial, but he finds in the Pombalin plan all the qualities that are the basis of the modern movement. So there is this connection between modernism and Pombalin architecture that after Pardal Monteiro's publications and Carlos Ramos, at least he understands that also, so this becomes very clear. But the paradox still endures, because France's conception of what the city should be or should have been is modernist. So, but it is modernist in the sense that he treasures originality and innovation, and he's looking for something that is completely different and that Pombalin architecture cannot give him. So there are lots of paradoxes, and I think we can really try to discuss these things and enrich the perspective that we have on them from that basis. As far as the future of the Pombalin typology, I don't know. I'm not an architect, but I think there are good examples nowadays. I have to say that I really like, and I don't know the name of the architects, but I really like the buildings that are now recently built on Martim Muniz, for instance. I think this is a very extreme, they are very clever in their dialogue with Pombalin tradition and very contemporary at the same time. So even though I don't know very well the plan or the, I think there is something there that it's worth thinking and discussing. Thank you.
I don't know if there is anyone else that would like. Okay. Yes. Just want to mention that we are way behind schedule.
Obrigada. Thank you very much, Joana. I really appreciate what you have talked about, and I have learned about also very much. And I was thinking, it's not really a question, it's some notes also about all your lecture. I was thinking about livre do desassossego and the kind of love that Bernardo Soares has to this monotony. Mm-hmm. The monotony is very creative and is dwelling dreams and small details that where there is no monotony we cannot find. And it was only this.
It's true. It's true, and I hope I made clear that if we look closely to Pombalin architecture, we actually find in details, in tiny details, this ennobling of architecture that our eyes, because they are so used to volume and to sculptural effects in architecture. They are yes, so it really needs a different kind of look, but I think it's there. Yes, these tiny details.
So I'm sure there are much more questions, but we can continue to discuss outside. So now we should make a very short coffee break, maybe 10 minutes, I would say. And then we continue. Unfortunately, Manuel Massini won't be able to deliver his presentation, but then we are going to listen to Luciano Maraveglio, of course. So, até já.